The night she brought it up, we were just finishing dinner. I was stacking dishes in the sink, still chewing on the last few bites of lasagna, when Emily's voice sliced through the air. "So, I need to ask you something," she said, her tone icy. I looked over, caught off guard. "Okay." She leaned back, arms crossed, eyes sharp and accusing. "Back when you used to work late all the time, you think I didn't know?" The room fell silent. It had been years since we'd talked about those late nights, the barely there flirtation with a co-worker that never went anywhere. I thought we'd put that behind us, but the look in her eyes told me otherwise. You know nothing happened," I said quietly, setting the dishes down, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing happened?" She let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You were checked out, Evan. Checked out on us, on me. That's not nothing." I closed my eyes, guilt flickering to life again. I couldn't deny it. Those long hours, the tension, the countless times I'd stayed out a little too late, making excuses. I thought Emily had forgiven me, or at least chosen to move past it. "I'm sorry," I started, but she held up a hand, cutting me off. "That's not what this is about," she said. Her voice was calmer now, chillingly calm. "It's about the fact that you broke something, Evan. You broke something between us. And I've been waiting for a long time to feel like you fixed it." I stared at her, caught between wanting to reach out to her and feeling the sting of anger rising in my chest. I can't go back in time and undo it. I thought we agreed to move forward. She just looked at me, her silence hanging heavy in the air. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, she said, "Maybe I'm done waiting." With that, she grabbed her purse, threw on her coat, and headed for the door. "Wait, what do you mean?" I asked, a pit forming in my stomach. She turned back, one eyebrow raised. "I need to figure out what's fair, Evan, and you'll just have to deal with that." Then she left, the sound of the door slamming echoing in the empty room. I stood there, stunned, the words echoing in my head. I wanted to chase after her, to beg her to come back and talk, but something in me hesitated, held back by the quiet fury I saw in her eyes. In that moment, a knot of fear and regret began to twist inside me. I knew something had shifted between us, something irreversible, and there was nothing I could do but wait for the fallout. The first time I met Paul, I didn't think much of him. He wasn't flashy or particularly charismatic, just an average guy with a receding hairline and the kind of overly polite manner that grated on me. Emily introduced him as a friend from book club, flashing me a smile that felt forced. "Paul, this is my husband, Evan," she said, her tone a little too casual. He extended his hand, and I shook it, noting the way he sized me up in the briefest of moments. His grip lingered just long enough to make me uncomfortable. "Nice to meet you," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Likewise," I lied, already feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The interaction should have ended there. A quick hello, maybe some small talk. But Emily seemed intent on drawing him into our space. "Paul's a contractor," she said brightly. "He actually offered to help with the kitchen sink. You know, the one you haven't gotten around to fixing?" The jab landed squarely, but I let it slide. "Oh, really?" I said, turning to Paul. "Appreciate the offer, but I'll get to it this weekend." Paul raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense, Ming. Just trying to help." I nodded, trying not to let my irritation show. Something about his tone felt off, as if he were taking a subtle dig at me. But Emily seemed perfectly at ease, even energized. Over the next few weeks, Paul's name started popping up more and more in conversations. He'd recommended a great bottle of wine for her book club. He'd shared some funny story about his childhood. He'd offered to bring over tools to help with a project she wanted to start in the backyard. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Emily was outgoing. She'd always been the kind of person who made friends easily. But there was an edge to how she spoke about him, a flicker of something new in her eyes when she mentioned his name. One night, after another glowing anecdote about Paul, I couldn't help myself. "So, what's the deal with this guy?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" You talk about him a lot. I didn't realize book club was co-ed." She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Is there a problem, Evan?" "No, I hesitated, unsure how to frame my discomfort without sounding paranoid. "I guess it's just weird. You've been spending a lot of time with him." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, come on, he's a friend. Or, am I not allowed to have those anymore? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The last thing I wanted was to sound controlling or insecure. But the nagging feeling in my gut refused to quiet. That was the first time I noticed how Emily seemed to enjoy my discomfort, how her lips curled into the faintest smirk as I struggled for the right words. She wanted me to feel it, the doubt, the jealousy. In hindsight, that should have been my warning. But instead of confronting it head-on, I convinced myself that it was all in my head. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Emily scrolled through her phone beside me. I told myself to let it go, to trust her like I always had. But as I listened to the faint sound of her typing, that knot in my stomach tightened. Temptation. Betrayal. They're like cracks in glass, small at first, but spreading with every touch, every shift. And in the darkness of that room, I had no idea how far those cracks would go. It wasn't long before Paul started showing up more frequently. Emily claimed he was just being helpful, offering to fix something, lending her a book, or dropping by to brainstorm ideas for her new garden project. At first, I played the role of the indifferent husband, brushing off my unease with excuses. But the tension was building, and we both knew it. One Saturday, Emily decided to throw an impromptu dinner party. She invited a couple of her friends from book club, and, of course, Paul. It's casual, she said with a shrug. Just a few people hanging out. I agreed, hoping the social setting might ease the tension that had taken root in my chest. Maybe if I saw Paul interact with others, I'd realize I was overreacting. That night, as the guests arrived, everything felt normal at first. The wine flowed, laughter echoed through the house, and I started to relax. But when Paul walked in, he immediately made his way to Emily, bypassing everyone else. "Hey you," he said, grinning as he handed her a bottle of wine. "Paul, you didn't have to bring anything," Emily said, her face lighting up. "Of course I did. You deserve it." The exchange was subtle but charged. I watched the way his hand lingered on hers as she took the bottle, the way she leaned in slightly when he spoke. The other guests seemed oblivious, but my pulse quickened. As the evening wore on, it became harder to ignore the undercurrent between them. Paul's laughter rang a little louder at Emily's jokes, his compliments a little too smooth. At one point, I caught them huddled together by the kitchen counter, speaking in hushed tones. "What's so funny?" I asked, walking over. Emily glanced at me, startled. "Oh, nothing. Paul was just telling me about this ridiculous thing that happened at work." Paul smirked. "Didn't want to bore you with it, Evan." I forced a laugh, trying to hide the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm sure I can handle it." He chuckled, but his eyes lingered on Emily before he walked away. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, I confronted her. "Emily, what's going on with Paul?" I asked, my voice low but firm. She froze, midway through wiping down the counter. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," I said, the frustration finally breaking through. "The way he looks at you, the way you light up around him, it's not nothing." She set the rag down and turned to face me, her expression a mix of defiance and weariness. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" "Yes, you are," she snapped. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound? Paul is just a friend. God forbid I have someone in my life who makes me feel appreciated." The word appreciated hit like a slap. Appreciated? "Emily, I'm your husband. I've been here trying to make things work, trying to fix. Fix what? The years of damage you caused." Her voice was sharp, her eyes blazing. "You think I forgot about all those nights you weren't here? All the times I felt invisible while you were off, working late? Don't you dare lecture me about what's appropriate." The silence that followed was deafening. She stared at me, daring me to respond, but I couldn't find the words. That night, I lay in bed beside her, the gulf between us wider than ever. My mind raced, replaying every look, every smile she had shared with Paul. Was I imagining it? Or was this something darker? A retaliation she wouldn't admit? Sleep didn't come easily. And by morning, the doubt that had once been a flicker was now a roaring flame, threatening to consume everything we had left. It was a Wednesday night when she didn't come home. Emily had texted around 6, saying her book club was meeting, that they were staying late to discuss something really juicy. I felt a chill at the words, the same creeping dread I'd felt for weeks now, only louder. I sent back a short, "Okay, be safe," and waited restless, the hours ticking by. By midnight, I called her twice, but both went to voicemail. No response to my texts. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, mind spinning with the possibilities I didn't want to admit. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I heard her stumble through the front door, the faint scent of wine and perfume drifting into the hallway. I stayed in bed, listening to her shuffle into the bathroom, waiting for the sound of the water as she washed off her makeup. She slid into bed beside me, her movements unsteady. I could feel her beside me, so close and yet miles away. For a long while, I kept my back to her, silent. But the questions swelled inside me, clawing their way out. "Where were you?" My voice sounded colder than I intended. Emily's body tensed beside me, but she didn't turn. "Ow!" We lost track of time. Her voice was slurred, her words landing heavy in the dark. "With your book club friends?" I asked, each word slow, deliberate. "Yeah, Evan," she said, an edge to her tone. "What? You don't believe me?" I took a breath, trying to control the heat rising in my chest. "I called you. You didn't answer." She let out a long sigh, almost dismissive. "I didn't check my phone." "God, Evan, do you have to interrogate me every time I'm out?" "It's not every time," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Just lately." She finally turned to face me, her eyes cold, unfocused. "You don't get to question me like this. Not after what you put me through." Her words stung, but I held her gaze, refusing to look away. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "that maybe I'm done living by your rules. Maybe I'm finding my own way." The implication hit hard, and a sick feeling twisted in my gut. I thought of Paul, his 2 long stares, the way his hand lingered on hers, the quick glances they'd shared when they thought I wasn't looking. "Is this about him?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Is there something going on with you and Paul?" She laughed, the sound hollow, bitter. "Oh, now you're jealous? Now you care? Just answer me." She looked at me, her eyes dark, defiant. "Maybe I don't have to answer you anymore. Maybe you already know." The room fell into silence, her words hanging between us like a knife. I felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me free-falling into some dark, endless place. I'd always known something was off. The smiles, the laughter that she saved for him, the spark I hadn't seen in her eyes in years. But hearing it, seeing the way she looked at me with that quiet, satisfied fury, it was like a punch to the gut. "Emily," I whispered, but the words dried up, my mind blank with shock. She rolled over, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. "Go to sleep, Evan," she said softly. "We can talk in the morning." I lay there, staring at her back, feeling every ounce of betrayal, regret, and guilt I'd ever felt, magnified 1,000 times. The memories flooded back, the nights I'd taken her for granted, the years I'd let slip by, thinking we'd somehow stay solid without trying. And now, lying beside me, she was already gone, her silence a wall I couldn't scale. Morning felt like a lifetime away, and in the dark, alone with my thoughts, I realized there was no going back. After that night, the doubt became unbearable. Each time Emily left the house, I felt the weight of it pressing down, that sick feeling that something was slipping further and further out of my control. And I couldn't shake the memory of her words, the way she'd looked at me, defiant, almost taunting. I'd never been the type to check her phone. It went against everything I thought our relationship was built on. But when she fell asleep one night, phone face down on her nightstand, the temptation was too strong. I'd spent hours wrestling with the idea, arguing with myself, telling myself I was paranoid. But as I lay there, staring into the darkness, her slow breathing next to me, my hand seemed to move on its own. I unlocked her phone and scrolled through her messages. At first, it was nothing. Text to friends, reminders, even the usual string of messages from the book club group chat. But then I saw a conversation with Paul. It was buried under a string of others, marked by a single name and time-stamped with the nights she'd come home late. I tapped on the thread, and what I saw made my stomach drop. "Tonight was amazing. You don't know how much I needed that," she'd written a few weeks back. Paul's response was immediate. "Same here. Can't stop thinking about it. When can we do it again?" I kept scrolling, feeling my throat tighten with every word. There were messages filled with inside jokes, casual flirtations, and intimate details that cut deeper than any open confession ever could. But it wasn't just the words. It was the way she spoke to him, the way she seemed alive in these conversations. Like she'd tapped into a version of herself I hadn't seen in years. And then there it was, the words I dreaded. "He has no idea. Serves him right, doesn't it?" The message was like a punch to the gut. The realization settled over me like a fog, thick and choking. This wasn't just an affair. This was something calculated, something she'd allowed to grow from her resentment, her anger, all the things she'd held against me for so long. I turned off her phone and lay back, staring at the ceiling, feeling like the world had shifted under me. My mind raced, piecing together every moment that had led to this. The late nights, the laughter she'd saved for someone else, the barely hidden thrill she took in watching me squirm. This was never about Paul. It was about us, about the cracks we'd ignored, the wounds I'd tried to pretend didn't exist. She was lashing out in the most hurtful way possible, knowing full well that I'd feel every ounce of it. The next morning, Emily woke up before me, her face calm, serene, as if she hadn't been plotting a betrayal that would rip us apart. I watched her get dressed, her movements casual, indifferent, as if nothing had changed. And maybe for her, nothing had. She'd wanted this, needed this, and she'd gotten away with it, without a hint of remorse. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was that sick desire to understand why, to understand how she could throw everything away so easily. So I got up, dressed, and pretended to go through the motions. I acted as though I hadn't seen her messages, as though I didn't know every word she'd shared with him. But every time she looked at me, every time she offered a thin smile, I felt the crack widening between us. I knew one thing. I couldn't let her keep that power, that satisfaction. Not anymore. It was my turn to decide what happened next. The days that followed were a haze of tension and silence. I didn't bring it up, didn't confront her, not yet. But every glance, every casual, "How was your day?" felt loaded. It was as though she knew I'd seen the messages, sensed I was hanging by a thread but was waiting for me to break. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, the silence grew unbearable. She was scrolling on her phone, absently picking at her food. I couldn't take it anymore. "Emily," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, startled, a hint of guilt flashing in her eyes before she masked it with her usual calm. "Yes?" she asked, still chewing, as if I'd interrupted something minor, something routine. I set down my fork, gathering the anger I'd been swallowing for days. "How long are we going to pretend this is normal?" She blinked, then gave a practiced, nonchalant shrug. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about." Her expression hardened, and a cold smirk twisted her lips. "So, you looked at my phone, didn't you?" The accusation was quick, calculated. She was turning it around, making it about my invasion of her privacy. I could feel my pulse in my temples, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Why?" I asked, staring her down. "Why am? And why did you feel like I deserved this?" She took a slow sip of her wine, savoring it, her eyes never leaving mine. "You really don't get it, do you? Then explain it to me." She set her glass down, her fingers tracing its stem. "You left me alone a long time ago, Evan. You gave your attention to everyone but me. You took me for granted, stopped trying, stopped caring. I waited. I forgave, but the damage was done." The words stung, dredging up all the old guilt, the late nights, the times I'd ignored her for work or friends, or my own selfish distractions. But none of it justified this. "So this is payback?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Maybe." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Or maybe it's just a reminder that you're not the only one who can have a life, who can feel alive. The words hung between us, poisonous and final. I realized then that this wasn't something that could be talked out. She didn't regret it. She didn't feel sorry, didn't feel anything at all but contempt. I swallowed, feeling like I was on the edge of something huge and irreversible. So where does that leave us? She shrugged again, as though the answer was obvious. Maybe we're done, Evan. Maybe it's time we stopped pretending. The casual indifference in her voice broke something inside me, something fragile I hadn't known I was still clinging to. In that moment, I felt a cold clarity settle over me, a grim resolve I hadn't felt before. I nodded slowly, standing up from the table. All right, if that's what you want. She didn't respond, just watched me with that same detached look, like she'd won some unspoken game, her victory complete. But she had no idea what I had planned. She'd taken everything from me, my pride, my trust, my belief in us. But there was one thing I could take back, something that would make her realize that actions have consequences. As I left the room, I knew exactly what I needed to do. This wasn't just going to end with her walking away unscathed. She was going to feel it too. The moment I decided to act, something in me snapped into focus. I'd spent weeks agonizing over her betrayal. But now, for the first time, I felt almost calm. It was a dark kind of calm, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to lose. Emily seemed unfazed by our confrontation. She went about her days as though nothing had happened, as though our marriage wasn't crumbling right under her feet. There was a freedom in her, a lightness I hadn't seen in years. And every time I caught her smiling, every time she laughed to herself at some text on her phone, the bitterness rose inside me like bile. Paul. She'd chosen Paul, of all people. A man I barely knew, a stranger she'd welcomed into our lives with a shamelessness that cut me down every time I thought about it. I couldn't let this continue. I wouldn't just sit back while she unraveled everything we'd built. So I started digging, looking for cracks, for leverage, anything I could use to regain some control, to remind her that there were still consequences. I began with Paul. It didn't take long to find his social media profile, photos of his carefully curated life. He wasn't the single guy he pretended to be. He had a wife, kids even. The realization hit like a spark, igniting a cold, calculated plan I hadn't even known was forming. I saved his wife's contact info, sat on it for days, debating. I wanted her to know, to see him the way I saw him, a liar, a cheater, just like Emily. But something kept stopping me, some stubborn part of me that wondered if I'd be dragging another innocent person into this mess just to ease my own pain. But Emily's words echoed in my mind. You left me alone a long time ago. She tried to make me feel guilty, as if I'd forced her into this. But nothing justified what she'd done. And the idea of Paul getting away with it, of the two of them carrying on as if I'd disappeared, no, I couldn't accept that. One evening, I caught her texting him from across the room. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. The casual smirk on her face as she typed felt like a slap. I couldn't hold back any longer. You know he's married, right? I said, keeping my voice calm, conversational. Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing. Excuse me? Paul, I said, watching her reaction carefully. He has a wife. And kids, actually. Emily's face twisted, but it wasn't shock I saw there. It was irritation, anger. She didn't care about the lies he'd told her. She only cared that I knew. So you're stalking him now? She shot back, folding her arms. I shrugged. Not stalking, just finding the truth. Thought you'd like to know. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. You're pathetic, Evan. You're grasping at straws. Maybe, but I'm not the one sneaking around with a married man. The words hit, and for a second, I saw a flash of uncertainty in her eyes. But it faded just as quickly, replaced by that hard, defiant glare. You pushed me to this. You made me feel invisible for years. And now you're acting like the victim? Maybe I am, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. But you can't pretend you're innocent in this. She looked at me with something close to disgust. I don't care what you think anymore, Evan. She turned to leave, but I called after her, my voice cold, steady. Paul's wife might, though. She froze, her shoulders stiffening. Slowly, she turned back, her face pale. You wouldn't. I held her gaze, letting her see the resolve in my eyes. Watch me. Her expression faltered, fear flickering there for the first time. I let her see it, let her realize that she wasn't the only one with the power to make things unravel. She'd taken everything from me, but I wasn't just going to lie down and let her walk away unscathed. I wanted her to feel it the way I had, and as she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, I knew she finally understood. This wasn't over. Not yet. After our confrontation, the silence between us grew heavy, tense. Emily moved through the house like a stranger, barely meeting my gaze, her mouth set in a hard line. She knew I had the power to shatter her new life with a single phone call, and that knowledge was slowly stripping away her confidence. She thought she'd been the one in control, but now I held the cards. It was early one morning when I made the call. The voice on the other end was quiet, wary, Paul's wife, Sarah. I could hear kids in the background, the sounds of a life he'd compartmentalized to hide his secrets. Hi, is this Sarah? I asked, steadying my voice. I'm sorry to call you out of the blue like this, but I think we need to talk. It's about your husband, Paul. There was a pause, the kind that hangs heavy with realization. Who is this? She asked, her voice laced with dread. Name's Evan. I'm married to a woman who's been involved with Paul. Another silence, longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. Are you sure? Yeah, I said quietly. I'm sure. I told her everything. I didn't leave out the details. I wanted her to know the truth, as brutal as it was. She deserved to see him for who he really was, the way I'd been forced to see Emily. And as I recounted the nights they'd spent together, the messages, the way they'd woven their betrayal into our lives, I felt a strange sense of release, a cold satisfaction that they couldn't escape this anymore. By the end, Sarah was silent. I could hear her breathing, the ragged sound of someone absorbing a truth that's tearing them apart. I'm sorry, I said, surprised to feel a twinge of guilt, the smallest pang of empathy for the pain she was now feeling. After a long pause, she replied, Thank you for telling me. I needed to know. The call ended, and I sat there, the weight of everything settling in. I just set something in motion that couldn't be undone, a choice that would ripple out and destroy whatever illusions they'd built. But in that moment, I didn't care. Later that evening, Emily stormed into the house, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. What did you do? She demanded, her voice shaking with anger and something else, fear. I looked up from the kitchen counter, calm. I did what I said I'd do. You had no right, she yelled, her voice breaking. No right. I stood, meeting her furious gaze. I had every right, Emily. You dragged me into this. You brought him into our lives, made me question everything. You thought you could control this, but actions have consequences. Her face twisted, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You think you're going to come out of this clean? You think this makes you the hero? Not the hero, no, I said, stepping closer. But I'm done being the fool. She turned away, breathing hard, but I wasn't finished. This wasn't just some fling to you, was it? You wanted me to see it, to feel humiliated. You wanted me to pay for every mistake I made, real or imagined. But you know what, Emily? You're not the only one who can play that game. She was silent, her face a mask of fury and hurt, but I saw something else in her eyes, regret, maybe, or just the realization that she'd pushed too far. In the days that followed, the fallout was brutal. Paul left his job, his wife filed for divorce, and the last I heard, he'd moved out of state. And Emily, she barely looked at me, avoiding my gaze like I was the stranger now, the one who'd crossed a line. But I didn't regret what I'd done. For the first time, I felt free of the guilt, the endless cycle of blame and doubt. She tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she'd only set herself adrift. As I watched her pack her things, her silence heavy with resentment, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was done, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally ready to let go. The house felt emptier now, quieter. Emily's presence was still there. In the picture, she hadn't taken off the walls, the faint trace of her perfume in the hallway. But it was like a ghost lingering after a storm. The fallout from my call to Sarah came swiftly. Paul's marriage exploded in a spectacularly public way. I hadn't realized how deeply Sarah would dig once I'd given her that initial shove. She found receipts, messages, even photos. She confronted Paul at his office, and word spread quickly through their social circles. Emily couldn't escape the ripple effects. By the time she returned from work one evening, she looked like she'd been through a war. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. She dropped her purse by the door and sat at the kitchen table, staring at me as if daring me to gloat. I didn't. There was nothing left to say. "So, congratulations," she said bitterly. "You destroyed his life. You happy now?" "I didn't destroy his life," I replied evenly. "He did that himself, just like you destroyed this." Her eyes flashed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "Do you even get it, Evan? Why I did it? Or are you too busy playing the victim to see your part in all this?" I stared at her, the weight of her words washing over me. "Oh, I get it, Emily. Believe me, I get that I wasn't perfect, that I let you down. But this wasn't about fixing us. It was about tearing me apart." She flinched, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped. Beneath the anger, the bitterness, I saw something raw, something vulnerable. "I wanted you to hurt," she admitted softly, her voice cracking. "I wanted you to feel what I felt all those years, forgotten, unimportant. I wanted you to know what it's like to be invisible." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger. I felt tired, exhausted by the endless blame, the cycle of wounds we kept inflicting on each other. "And now?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Do you feel better?" She looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "No, not really." The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we couldn't say. There were no winners here, no triumphant revenge. Just two people staring at the wreckage of what they'd once built together, unsure how it had all gone so wrong. Eventually, Emily spoke again, her voice hollow. "Paul's gone. His wife kicked him out, and he's moving across the country. He tried to call me, but I blocked him." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Part of me felt vindicated, but it was a hollow victory. I didn't want her to suffer. Not really. I just wanted her to understand the pain she'd caused. "I'm leaving too," she said finally, her tone flat. My stomach tightened, but I didn't argue. We'd reached the end of the line, and we both knew it. "Where will you go?" "My sister's. At least for a while," she said. "I need time to figure things out." I nodded again, the words catching in my throat. "Take care of yourself, Emily." She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or a bittersweet kind of relief. "You too, Evan." As she walked out the door for the last time, I felt a strange mix of emotions, grief, yes, but also a sense of closure. The storm had passed, and while the damage was undeniable, there was a quiet stillness in its wake. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The days after Emily left were eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that sits heavy on your chest, making you feel like the house itself is mourning. Her absence wasn't just physical. It was a void that echoed in the spaces we'd once shared, the routines we'd fallen into, even the fights that had kept us tethered together. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. I wandered through the house, catching glimpses of her life still scattered among my own. Her half-empty bottle of perfume on the dresser, the mug she always used sitting in the sink. I should have been angry or relieved or something, but all I felt was the weight of the silence. It wasn't until I found her old journal buried in a drawer that the grief truly hit me. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for paperwork when the leather-bound book caught my eye. I flipped it open, curious, and saw her handwriting, neat, deliberate, raw. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. The entries were from years ago, back when the cracks in our marriage had just started to form. Page after page of thoughts she'd never shared, emotions she'd kept bottled up. "Evan doesn't see me anymore. It's like I'm furniture, just something in the background. I miss who we were, but I don't know how to get back there. Maybe we can't. Sometimes I wonder if he even loves me, or if we're just pretending because it's easier than admitting it's broken." I sat there, reading her pain, and for the first time, I saw the version of me she'd been living with. The version I'd ignored, dismissed, brushed off with excuses like, I'm tired or work is stressful. She'd been drowning while I told myself the currents weren't that strong. But as I kept reading, I found something else. I want to leave him, but I can't. There's still something there, some part of me that hopes he'll see me again, that he'll fight for us. She'd wanted me to fight, and I hadn't. Not until it was too late. Not until the damage was so deep that neither of us could see a way out. By the time I closed the journal, my hands were shaking. I sat there for a long time, staring at the walls, the quiet pressing in around me. Eventually, I got up and started packing her things. Not out of anger or spite, but because I needed to. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what we'd lost. Each box I filled felt like a step forward, a way to reclaim the space as my own. But even as I worked, her words lingered in my mind. When I finished, I sat down at the dining table, the same one where we'd shared so many meals, so many arguments, and wrote her a letter. Emily, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. Not for what I did in the end, but for what I didn't do in the years leading up to it. I should have fought harder for us, listened when you were hurting, been the husband you deserved. I see that now. I don't know where you are or what you're feeling, but I hope you find peace. I hope you find what you were looking for, even if it wasn't me. Take care of yourself. Evan. I didn't expect her to write back, and she didn't. But that wasn't the point. Writing it wasn't for her. It was for me. The next morning, I stood on the back porch, staring at the sunrise. The light broke through the clouds, spilling over the horizon, and for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel heavy. The past was still there, like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. But as I stood there, breathing in the cool morning air, I realized something. The fire was out. And in its place, there was room to start over.